Hello, everyone. I'm glad you can join us this evening. So welcome to our next event. So this is part of our Decade of Commemorations programme, which is supported by Peace4 and SEUPB. That's a bit of a mouthful, but they're the ones that are supporting our exhibitions and all of our engagement programmes. So we're very grateful for all of their support. I think we have quite a few of you watching this evening, so I'm really glad. It's a lovely evening here in the Northwest, so I'm hoping it's a lovely evening for you too. My name is Bernadette Walsh, and I am the archivist at the Tower Museum. And in collaboration with the Nerve Centre, Paula, John and David, we are delighted to bring you this event this evening. We've been very excited for this event. Our exhibition is called Dividing Island, and it opened in the Tower Museum in July. It's actually closed at the moment because of COVID-19 restrictions, but the exhibition will run until February. So I'm sure we'll be open and you'll have a chance to call into us again. It's part of our annual exhibition programme, and this is the last exhibition in our Decade of Commemorations programme with the Nerve Centre. So far we've covered the First World War, conscription, 1916, and now we're looking at the period 1920 to 1922. The exhibition looks at the legacy, the origins, the impact and the legacy of the partition of Ireland. And while the exhibition is closed, this is a great opportunity for you to have a look at our website. So our website is towermuseumcollections.com, and we have lots of really great images of the collection. We've got videos, and we've got links to all of the other events in this programme. So if you get a chance, have a look at the exhibition, and all of our contact details are there as well if you've got any questions about future events. So this evening we have acclaimed historian Diarmaid Ferriter, and he is going to have a conversation with author Garrett Carr this evening. So Diarmaid, many of you will know, he's a regular television and radio broadcaster and writer. He's Professor of Modern Irish History at UCD, and his books include The Transformation of Ireland, 1900 to 2000, Judging Dev, a reassessment of the life and legacy of Eamon de Valera, which is an excellent book for the archive sources. If anyone is interested in accessing archive sources, it's a hugely great resource. Most recently, The Border and the Weight of a Century of Anglo-Irish Relations. Garrett is a lecturer in creative writing at Queen's University and author of another great book, Rule of the Land, Walking Ireland's Border, which was a BBC Radio 4 Book of the Week. He has also created a varied collection of maps of Ireland's border regions, which have been exhibited very widely. What I'm going to do next is I'm going to pass you over to Garrett and to Diarmaid, and just a few little, for those of you that are not familiar with these online webinars, if you can switch to gallery view, then you'll be able to see the participants. I'm going to log out, and you should be able to see Garrett and Diarmaid, and you'll be able to see the Nerve Centre logo. If you have any technical issues, they'll be able to sort you out. So once again, thank you very much for joining us this evening. Get in touch with us, put in comments, and even after the event, if you've got any questions about the exhibition Dividing Ireland or about our engagement programme, do feel free to contact us. Once again, thank you very much.
You can see me now. Thank you everybody for being here this evening. According to my little readout, we've got 148 people, which is great. I'm very glad to have you all here. So I'm talking to Diarmaid Ferriter tonight, the historian, and we're talking about the border, which is the subject of Diarmaid's last book, just published last year. And the first thing I want to ask you, Diarmaid, is not really a fair question, to be honest. It's perhaps almost more a philosophical one, because I did an interview recently with a Derry writer called Darren Anderson, who's just recently published a memoir about Derry called Inventory, but it's very good. And we were talking about the border, and the way he spoke of the border was this freakish occurrence from a set of weird coincidences that kind of came together, and it was a very unlikely sort of event. Whereas my way of looking at things is that everything since the Norman invasion points to the border, and everything leads. You'd have to go back to the Norman invasion if you wanted to find the step-off point to get us off this timeline. What do you think? Was the border inevitable?
No, it wasn't inevitable. I think the interesting thing about that conversation you had in relation to the bigger question, I think what's most interesting is that it wasn't being spoken about, the partition of Ireland or the creation of a border, until really a couple of years before it happened. There were no vocal or robust demands for a border on the island of Ireland until 7 or 8 years before it became a reality. And that's a relatively short space of time, So I think we've got to think about those who ultimately ended up with a border to safeguard their interests, they being those who wanted to remain in the United Kingdom and couldn't have any truck with the idea of a 32-county home rule Ireland. I think you've got to think about them and how they saw themselves and how they saw their mission as unionists. We've got to distinguish between Irish unionism and Ulster unionism. And even, the iconic leader who leads the campaign against the third Home Rule Bill, which is the first time Home Rule looks to be likely. He's a Dubliner. Edward Carson saw himself as an Irish unionist. And even before him, if you look at the kind of landed leadership of unionism in the late 19th and early 20th century, people like Edward Saunderson, they too saw themselves as Irish unionists. They didn't see themselves as Ulster unionists. But if you have a look then at posters that were being used by James Craig a couple of decades later, for electoral purposes, the message is Ulster. We're Ulster. We're Ulster unionists. We're not Irish unionists. So that would suggest that the creation of Northern Ireland is something of a compromise for unionists also, in the sense that their political mission is to keep the whole of the island within the United Kingdom. And they end up, of course, with this solution, which was supposed to be a temporary solution. So I think when you look at it like that, it's perhaps not that surprising that there wasn't anything inevitable about this. Obviously, there was a difficulty in coming to any kind of an accommodation with nationalists, and nationalists had their own responsibilities in relation to that. But I do think right up to very late in his career, Edward Carson was still holding out hope that there might be a solution that would avoid the partition of Ireland. Because I think even some of those who consider themselves Irish unionists considered the division of Ireland to be a great tragedy. There's an extraordinary moment in the Theatre Royal in 1913 when Andrew Bonar Law, who's the leader of the Conservative Party, who is hitching his mast to the Unionist sail, he turns around to Edward Carson and asks him to reassure the Southern Irish Unionists that they're not going to be abandoned. And Carson says, "What is there I can say?" So, they're coming to a recognition that if they're going to be successful in their mission as unionists, they're actually going to have to rethink the idea of keeping the whole island. And they're actually going to have to start concentrating on the part of the country where they're most numerous. And of course, that then brings you back to all of the very long centuries of history that you're talking about. Why were they so dominant in that part of the country? And that's what takes you back, of course, to the social engineering of the 16th and the 17th centuries.
So you have this compromise situation that nobody's entirely satisfied with, to say the least. And I wonder if this is why, I think especially internationally, the border is often viewed as in a negative sense. People right across the world, they might know very little about Ireland. They might even really fully understand Irish independence, but they have the sense of Ireland's got a border in it, and this is a kind of an injustice. Why does the story never get sold that of it being a good thing? Because there are a substantial minority of people to whom the border is almost sacred, and from their point of view, it's a story of a last minute savior coming in. Phew, the border gets in just in time. But that story doesn't seem to get exported, or it doesn't have much traction. Why do you think that might be?
That's because the notion of it as sacred, or the notion of it as a very positive thing, is a profoundly political assertion from unionists, in the sense that they saw this as the safeguarding of the integrity of the United Kingdom and of the British Empire, of which they were a part at the time that the border was created. But if you put it in a wider context, it's actually part of a very broad-based tragedy. What do I mean by this? And I'm not making a political point when I say this. I'm talking about what's involved in the artificial division of such a small island. And if you consider now, you'll probably be familiar with the work of Kapka Kasabova when she writes about, you know, European borders. She's writing as a Bulgarian, and she's talking about the breakup of the Ottoman Empire and the contest for boundaries and disputed boundaries around that time, arising out of the huge convulsions of the First World War. We're part on this island of that wider story as well. We have an Irish manifestation of what are international boundary disputes that are very common with the decline of empires and the aftermath of the First World War. But she made the point that the reason why borders are seen as so negative and seen as an injustice is because there's a very strong sense of a solution being imposed on the periphery from the centre, and that this is done with impunity. In this case, you could argue from London, you know, that they pat themselves on the back for having come up with this solution. It's embraced by some people on the island. It's rejected by others. It actually creates new minority problems. But the reason why it is seen in such negative terms is because it's about a carve up, and it's a settlement which leads to such discord. And that's a European problem. If you think of Greece and Turkey and Bulgaria, when Kasabova was writing about that, again, there's great human tragedies and divisions at the heart of it. So yes, one person's freedom or one person's sacred protection of their rights is another person's captivity. It's very hard to fashion a positive narrative out of that isn't polemical and extremely one-sided. One of the interesting things that happens in London over the course of the treaty negotiations, you know, the year after partition becomes a reality, one of the interesting things that happens are the private exchanges between senior British politicians, many of whom identified as unionists, who were prepared to acknowledge privately that the division of Ireland is a great tragedy for practical reasons, whilst publicly, of course, they will adhere to the pre-sanctified dogma about the importance of the integrity of the United Kingdom. And I think that gulf between a private acknowledgement of what a tragedy it is to divide an island for practical reasons, the gulf between that and the public rhetoric is there throughout the decades. And it's there right up to the present day. You know, we're all consumed at the moment with this virus, this COVID virus. Mm-hmm. The border has become very relevant to that on this island. You know, how many times have we heard that a virus doesn't respect borders? Because it obviously doesn't. Infectious diseases don't respect these physical boundaries. And yet we have a situation on the island where we can't meaningfully get ahead of that virus when we have two different approaches to it on the two parts of the island. So in practical terms, that actually goes right back to what the British Prime Minister at the time of partition, David Lloyd George, said to unionists: you're cutting off the normal circuits of activity. And he was talking about trade, but there are other practical dimensions to, you know, the natural circuits that are affected by partition as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's fascinating. You can see why somebody might say it's a little unfair to say talking to the border positively is political, whereas talking about it negatively isn't. Although I definitely take your point about the wider context. And you're right, of course, that even for people who would vote to maintain it, it's very little, there isn't much love for the place in that sense. It's a kind of a necessary defense, I suppose. But also in your book, you talk about very interestingly about a partitionist mindset in the South, which you chart quite closely throughout the 20th century. Is this something that actually contributed, do you think, to the creation of the border, or is it something that sort of cohered after 1922?
Oh, it's definitely there before the creation of the border. I mean, let's not fool ourselves. And remember, I wrote this book as somebody who grew up in Dublin. You know, I was not somebody, as was so common with my generation, I was not someone who went over the border very often. I would have spent more time in London as a young man than I would have 100 miles up the road over the border. That was very common amongst my generation. And, you know, I think that was within us from a very early stage, that sense of everything over the border being different, almost being alien, almost being abstract. And there's certainly a distance there. But when I began to trace that mentality, it brought me right back. You know, I think it's the Achilles heel of an awful lot of the early 20th century generation of nationalists, because they write and speak about this in almost mystical terms. You know, I mean, this is the notion that Ireland is a sacred, unified territory that cannot be divided. They write about it almost in the abstract, but there doesn't seem to be much understanding of the mentality of those who live in Ulster. And of course, Ulster is a province. You know, Ulster is not the 6 counties that the Northern Ireland became. But, you know, there are quite a number of characters from Ulster who become involved in politics, in Republican politics, very committed nationalists and Republicans who can recognize this as well. It's no coincidence, for example, that some of the most trenchant critics of successive governments of the Republic's policy towards partition are Ulstermen. People like Sean McEntee, who was a Belfast Catholic, and Ernest Blythe, you know, they can hone their criticisms born of their Ulster background and their Ulster experiences. And they were very conscious of the failings of their generation of revolutionaries for making no efforts to understand the Unionist mindset, or indeed the Ulster mindset. You know, that sense that they already think of Ulster as the other, that it has a different character. That it is in some respects a separate entity, and they're called to account, I think, for that, and they can't really come up with any answers. And you know, there's a very long list of people who are guilty of thinking like that, and you know, it endured. I mean, I was reading Mary McAleese's autobiography there in recent times, and she makes much of that as somebody who came down from Belfast to Dublin to work, say, in RTE. Castigates the complete failure to either understand the reality of Northern Ireland in the 1960s or the 1970s, or make any attempt to educate themselves about it. And even more recently, I remember when Mark Durkan, the former SDLP leader, stood for Fine Gael in the European elections. And he got very irritated at what he regarded as this questioning of the appropriateness of him coming down here to stand in our constituencies, and he used the word borderist. These are borderist, these attitudes, you know. So it has manifested itself in various ways from 100 years ago right up to much more recent times. And I would still ask students, Garrett, as you know, a very important exercise at the start of a class to do with this period. How many of you have been in Northern Ireland? How many of you have been over the border? And there are more now than there would have been 15 or 20 years ago. But still, a surprising number have absolutely no experience of Northern Ireland. So it has endured.
I wonder, you talk about this failure to engage with Ulster identity. And I wonder, going right back to the discussions that led to partition, Arthur Griffith and his panel in London. I wonder, it's interesting that they were speaking to English people about Northern Ireland in London. If they were actually across the table from Edward Carson and other Ulster Unionists, would that have panned out differently? I mean, well, if only because they would have had they probably wouldn't have been subjected to such a charm offensive, at least.
Well, I mean, James Craig did eventually meet both Eamon de Valera and Michael Collins, you know, and he found Michael Collins much easier to deal with. Most people found Michael Collins easier to deal with than de Valera. Because de Valera tended to give abstract history lessons when he was talking to Unionists, and James Craig, you know, this did his head in. Whereas he found Michael Collins was more practical, you know, and they came up with this kind of pact in 1922 to try and take the heat out of what really was a horrendous year. I mean, there were 300 people killed in 1922. The birth of Northern Ireland is so bloody. But when you talk about, you know, Irish nationalists speaking to English politicians about it, what strikes me as perhaps equally revealing as their lack of dialogue with Unionists is the barely concealed antipathy that London has for Northern Ireland and for Unionists, you know. And David Lloyd George was great for speaking very frankly, according to his secretary, Tom Jones. You see, Tom Jones, David Lloyd George's secretary, thankfully for us, left his diaries behind, and he recorded these exchanges in minute detail. Now, they're not gospel, you know, and we have to account for a degree of embellishment, but there's a consistent theme there, is that these bloody Ulster folk are such a nuisance. And the way David Lloyd George put it, you know, they're a pugnacious people, you know. And he said, you know, we're not with them. We're only with them to the extent that we don't want civil war on our door. We don't love them. You know, there's no great embrace or empathy there. And I think that's one of the reasons why such a strong sense of an Ulster Unionist identity develops, because they certainly don't trust Dublin, but they don't trust London either. And again, that has endured, and there are reasons for that. And even at a much later stage, you know, when sworn enemies come together like Ian Paisley and Martin McGuinness, what they can both agree on, I think, is that it's better for us to take as much control of Ulster as we can, because we don't trust London to do it. So, you know, they can, over the course of time, come to an accommodation about that. But yeah, it is, you know, to go back to your point, it is remarkable when you consider the lack of dialogue. But there's also a sense, particularly with James Craig as he takes over from Carson, and Ronan Fanning, the historian, used this phrase, him sitting on Ulster like a rock, and I'm not talking to anyone about it, you know, and we're not going to engage in dialogue. And then later, when partition becomes more entrenched, you also have the question of the territorial claim that exists in the Irish Constitution over Northern Ireland, which is like a red flag to a unionist bull. So they're certainly not going to engage in any kind of dialogue. And that takes time. I mean, it's a Cold War, and there's a thaw eventually in the late 1950s and into the 1960s before it's interrupted again by the Troubles, you know. But there was a sense that, okay, let's look at practical stuff. Can we look at tourism or waterways or non-contentious issues? But the other interesting thing, which I think is always neglected, this is not just about unionists in the new Northern Ireland. It's also about those who are left in Cavan and Monaghan and Donegal, who consider themselves to be unionists, mostly Protestant. There's 70,000 Protestants in those three counties on the wrong side of the border. So you have the 1/3 Catholic minority, a nationalist minority, obviously, in Northern Ireland, who don't feel they're part of this state. But there's also that other minority question on the other side of the border. And they have to accommodate themselves to a new dispensation as well, which is difficult.
Would you agree the nationalist delegation in the lead up to Irish independence and partition, they seemed outmaneuvered?
Oh, there's no doubt about that. Yeah, I mean, Arthur Griffith in particular. We have to remember, I suppose, like Arthur Griffith and Michael Collins together represented, you know, different strands of the Irish nationalist movement. I mean, Arthur Griffith was not a Republican. He never claimed to be a Republican in the sense that some of his colleagues were. You know, I mean, his original political manifesto was based on the idea of Ireland staying as a united entity within the empire, the so-called dual monarchy. He's seen as a moderate. And what they do is they isolate him. And this is a classic negotiating strategy. You look for what they regarded as the weakest link. And it's not that Arthur Griffith didn't have considerable heft and ability, and he was quite a brilliant man in all sorts of ways and a great journalist. But they realized that perhaps he was not one of the diehards. And that was always the description that was used about some of his colleagues. So they get him to agree to things. David Lloyd George in particular takes advantage of this. He gets them to agree to things in kind of little side meetings, which is another negotiating tactic. And then he kind of impales him on the cross, and he's vulnerable. But you know, the big naivety, I suppose, of Arthur Griffith is that he accepts the idea of a boundary commission, that this border will be reviewed, because they're trying to get over the hump of partition, which is already reality. So they say, we'll kick it to touch, we'll get it reviewed in a couple of years by a boundary commission. And Arthur Griffith translates a boundary commission into a plebiscite, and it's nothing of the sort. And it wasn't that people were going to be voting directly on whether they wanted to stay in the new Northern Ireland or not. And, you know, Griffith perhaps knew deep down that wasn't a reality. But yeah, he is outmaneuvered, and there is inexperience, and they were facing what you would describe as a very heavyweight British negotiating team, of course, including famously Winston Churchill. Yes. And it's not that there wasn't cleverness on the Irish side and considered insight. There was, but they were outmaneuvered. And you know what the biggest failure they made, Garrett? They didn't have a bottom line. You don't go into negotiations without a bottom line. And the problem was there were two sets of negotiators. There were those who were in London, in Downing Street, and there were those who stayed at home, most famously De Valera, who were sniping from Dublin and who are sending instructions from Dublin sometimes too late in the day. So they're not coherent.
Yeah, it seems, yes, quite a messy process. But I'm wondering, yes, we can imagine intransigent unionism, and we can imagine sort of duplicitous politicians in London. But isn't there something inherent perhaps in these men as well, that sometimes it looks to me like a simple kind of lack of imagination, that they can't conceive of the partition of Ireland, and therefore it sort of slips by them?
I think that is a really interesting point, and it's a really interesting point in relation to the creation, not just the creative imagination, but bridging the gulf between their writings, their thoughts, and the practicalities of negotiation and of compromise.
Yes.
They're not ready for compromise. They're not ready for thinking creatively about compromise. De Valera in particular has a great blind spot about this, because his attitude throughout is that Britain imposed it, and the only way it can be undone is if Britain decides to undo it. Like, that's a huge failure of imagination, you know. Now, not everyone is like that, but there is.
I was talking about that in the 1940s. He's still on that.
He's still on that. No, I mean, he never loses it. I mean, eventually in private, we know in the late 1950s, before he left, because I think he was very conscious that he'd never succeeded in one of his main political aims, which is to end partition. He does talk about the prospect of Ireland rejoining the Commonwealth, you know, a united Ireland rejoining the Commonwealth, that there is a compromise he's prepared to make. But I mean, that's, it's far too late in the day. But you're absolutely right. I mean, there is that failure. I mean, these people have been reared often on a diet that of the mythical unity. And I say mythical unity because they gloss over an awful lot of the fissures and the differences and the complexities that were always there. Owen MacNeill does this as well as a historian, you know, when he goes right back and constructs a narrative of the history of Ireland that doesn't acknowledge, again, you know, the deep divisions and complexities that are inherent in Ireland as an entity anyway. So when it comes to translating you know, their writings, their history, and what they've been taught into practical politics, you know, they fall at that hurdle. I don't think there's any doubt about that. But you could argue unionists do likewise, in the sense that they have their own version of history, which is distorted and which is polemical and which serves a particular purpose around rallying their supporters in the face of a threat. It's very reactive. It's very defensive. And they have much that's distinctive, and arguably they have much to celebrate in terms of their own identity. But that too can get lost when it's all thrown into the pot. It's very interesting, you know, in the years between the failure of the first Home Rule bills in the 1880s and the 1890s, and then up to the third Home Rule bill, there's actually quite a lot of infighting within unionism. There are class tensions, there are farmer unionists, there are working class unionists. And it's a reminder that unionism is not monolithic. Unionism has never been monolithic. And whilst they campaign and rally around the idea of one voice, you know, that was never truly reflective of the unionist family.
You kind of, this word going forward in time a little, but you sort of came close to the subject there, so I'll take it up now. So yeah, as you mentioned, it took a long time through the 20th century for sort of the Irish political imagination to think we need to start actually engaging with Ulster unions, these people. But lately now with the Brexit debate, there's a phrase that's gained a lot of traction, and I'm not sure where it came from, but it's the idea that it's not Ireland's border, it's Britain's border in Ireland. And I think it might originate with Darragh O'Brien, the comedian, who threw it out on television. But that seems to me that's flashing back to the 1930s, isn't it?
It certainly didn't begin with Darragh O'Brien. And
I just mean as a kind of a phrase that was
thrown around. Yeah. And I mean, Darragh O'Brien, Darragh O'Brien is a contemporary of mine, and from Bray, and you know, again would have grown up in the south during the era of the Troubles, and you know. I don't imagine he spent much time over the border either. But it's a very interesting...
The sentiment is we're not responsible for the border. It's people in England.
Oh, well, this is the point. You see, that if you call the border the Irish border or the British border, you're going to get into trouble either way, for very obvious reasons. Isn't the border a creation of both Britain and Ireland? Couldn't you argue that the demand for a border is a product of the failure of Irish people to agree, and that it has to be seen not just as a British creation, but something that was born with the assistance of Irish midwives as well? So I don't think it can be referred to either as exclusively a British border or an Irish border. Of course, you can argue that this was a British imposed solution. But it's also something that was accepted by unionists in Ireland. And it was, you know, something that was a product of those upheavals of that decade where Irish people could not agree. And there was a fundamental question asked when the partition debate began in the House of Commons in Westminster by Harry Lawson, who was a British Liberal MP with unionist sympathies. And he asked this basic question: how are you in this age, in this democratic age, how are you to force a million people, a million unionists into a system they don't want to be part of? How are you to turf that minority out of the United Kingdom? And that was the question, and that was the challenge. And there was a failure in Ireland to come up with a solution to that. And Britain, by 1920, regards it as imperative that they have to get a solution because it's the only way they can deal with our wider Irish problem. So yes, it's Walter Long primarily, who was a former leader of the Unionist Party, who drafts what becomes the Government of Ireland bill that partitions Ireland. But who did he talk to first and foremost? James Craig. He wasn't talking to Irish nationalists. He's talking to the British government. He's talking to James Craig. So in that sense, I can see the argument about the way in which this was created and foisted on certain people. But James Craig then referred to it as the ultimate sacrifice because they were cutting off their southern brethren. Now, you can take that with a pinch of salt when you consider what he got, the rock that he got to sit on. But I don't think either label, British or Irish border, is at all satisfactory on their own, you know.
But I get the sense for the last 100 years anyway, the government in London would have accepted any solution that Ireland North and South came to. And
get it off our table.
Yeah, exactly. So that means it's Ireland's border.
I mean, no, that probably means the solution to the border in Ireland has to be an Irish solution. That's for me.
Whether you think of a
that's
border
for me
as an
the interesting
invention.
thing.
Sorry, I guess it maybe depends if you think of a border as an invention that is placed somewhere and there it stays, like a sculpture, or if you think of it as a lived continuum. And I guess I'm more the latter. And perhaps it's different in the 1920s, but now it's Ireland's border.
No, I take that point. That's a very good point, actually. And I do see it as a continuum. I don't see it as a historical artifact, you know, that's cemented. And we know that. How often have we spoken in recent years about an invisible border, you know? And there was a time when the border was anything but invisible. So, no, I accept that point. I mean, the interesting thing about the private exchanges again, you know, some of the most senior British officials, including people who ran the Treasury, people like Warren Fisher, they used to refer to the border as artificial, absurd, and ridiculous. And they went as far as to say, if we could get rid of it in the morning, we would. And why wouldn't they? It's always been a nuisance. It's always come back to bite them. You know, David Lloyd George famously boasted that he had conjured the Irish question out of existence. Well, he had in his backside, you know, he'd put the problem into cold storage, and of course it came back and continues to come back to haunt the British prime ministers, as we know from recent events. So, you know, they were prepared to make private admissions that this was something they didn't want. They wanted it off their table. It's very expensive, and it causes nothing but trouble, and it destabilizes English politics. And that's the flip side. You see, it has been useful in English politics, and it was useful in recent years arising out of Brexit. Because it was a pawn on the Irish question, and the border were again becoming a pawn in what was a distinctly English power game. It's very ironic, you could say, that the DUP were aligning themselves with arch-Tory nationalists who were much more concerned about Brexit than they were about Northern Ireland remaining a part of the UK. And we know that through polling of the Tory party as well. So there were times when it was useful, but it also had the capacity to become what was termed by Chamberlain a fatal influence on British politics, and they didn't want that. And what Irish nationalists and Republicans used to do in turn was to say that if you give us a declaration, if Britain gives us a declaration that they won't stand in the way of Irish unity, well, then we can sort out this problem ourselves, you know. But that, of course, suggested that they were going to be able to create the circumstances and a dialogue that would actually bring an end to the border. And there was never any evidence or sign of that.
I want to ask you a couple of what-if questions. Some people watching this will know you used to do a program for RTE Radio called What If, when you imagined different what's a counterfactual histories and what would have resulted. Brilliant program. And maybe you covered some of these in your episode, so I apologize if this is familiar terrain for you. We got one from somebody who's attending. The name's not up, but he's posted a question in the Q&A, and he's wondering what would have happened if Northern Ireland had been 4 counties, which at one point was the imagined arrangement. So the northeast corner. Where would we be now if that had occurred?
4 counties was the option that they were looking at, you know, and the idea of a 4-county Northern Ireland was considered for quite some time. I think it would have been too small to be feasible. You know, when you're wondering what would have happened, I think that probably would have worked to the advantage of those who wanted to get rid of the border altogether, a 4-county Northern Ireland. If you think about it as an entity, what it would have represented, what would have been viable for it in political and economic terms, you know, I can't imagine it would have survived. It would have just been too small. One of the reasons, of course, why there's an embrace.
That's what people said about 6 counties, didn't they?
They did, yeah, but not to the same extent as 4 counties. You know, I mean, there's a substantial difference. You know, the population of the new Northern Ireland in 1921 was 1.25 million. You know, if you had been looking at something that was well short of that, it might have been different. It's not just about, I appreciate, it's not just about population figures, but I do think, you know, given already what we know about the 6 counties and how arguably you could argue that the economy is very artificial and is hugely reliant on subvention and public sector employment. I think some of the economic difficulties would have been even more magnified by a 4-county entity.
I have another one for you. 1893, the Lords does not have a veto over the House of Commons. And the second Home Rule Bill is passed. Where would we be now?
We'd probably still be in the same position, unless 1893. You know, 1893. That decade, there's a sense that nationalism has lost its oomph and its verve. Parnell is gone. The downfall of Parnell creates a very difficult legacy for Irish nationalists. They don't really reunite until 1900 under the leadership of John Redmond. They're certainly not in a position to be aggressively pursuing, you know, their nationalist aims. So, you know, that 1890s, you know, if Home Rule had succeeded in the 1890s, there still would have been an opportunity for unionists to build a ferocious alliance against and argue and possibly to take up arms against this particular dispensation. So I think there would have been a great degree of destabilization that could have endured. So that instead of a lot of nationalists, as they did, you know, turning their attention to kind of cultural pursuits and cultural nationalism, they may well have found themselves trying to deal with the onslaught of a very substantial unionist resistance, not just in what would have been the new Northern Ireland then, but also in Southern Ireland. Yes, well, it
wouldn't have been quarantined, as one person put it, that you quote in your book, in the Northeast.
Well, you see, that was, yeah.
But this kind of gets back to my original point, doesn't it? So you can imagine these what-if scenarios, but they seem to resolve back around to bloodshed, at least, if not partition.
Well, so I mean, another what-if, of course, which is worth contemplating, is what would have happened if the third Home Rule Bill had been implemented after the First World War. It's postponed for the duration of the war. Nobody knows in 1914 how long that's going to last, and so much changes in the meantime. But if it had been imposed, the likelihood is there would have been civil war in Ireland. And as you know, there was civil war in Ireland. There were 2 civil wars in Ireland, because you could argue, and I would argue, that there was a civil war in the new Northern Ireland in the early 1920s. There's also one, of course, in 1922-3 in Southern Ireland. But there could have been a civil war at an earlier stage if Home Rule had been imposed against the will of unionists as a result of the third Home Rule Bill. If that had become a reality, it's very difficult to see how there would have been a peaceful protest as opposed to violent protest. Let's not forget that many people regarded Ireland as on the brink of serious bloodshed before the First World War in 1913, where you had both the Ulster Volunteer Force and the Irish Volunteers as paramilitary groups. They weren't particularly well armed, but they were armed, and they meant business.
So, what can we learn from this? This is a big question. What can we learn? Because right now, in other nations across the world, polemics or polarized groups are starting to take shape. At what point do you have to ring an alarm bell and say we need to address this? Because I would tend to agree with you. From any point from the mid 19th century on, it seemed there was going to be violent conflict. And is there anything that can be learned from this?
Well, I suppose one of the things that you can learn from recent times is that you can take the heat out of a border situation. Now, part of that, of course, has been a very long peace process that has not been without its setbacks. But even the physical manifestations of a border, I think there's a broad consensus that the infrastructure around a border being dismantled is a positive thing. And I mean, it struck me that even, the most trenchant unionists were very keen in the aftermath of Brexit to talk about how positive a free-flowing cross-border traffic is, and that, again, going back to the point about practicalities, this is a positive thing. So, I mean, that's one sign that, not having targets, a hard border always attracts violence. There's an infrastructure around it, and there's a symbolism around the infrastructure of a border that provokes and generates violent responses. We certainly know that from our history, as it does smuggling as well. I mean, some of the great border stories are smuggling stories, I mean, there's always a boom there for some when it comes to how you take advantage of such a porous border. I mean, it's extraordinary to think. I do quote one of the ordnance surveys from the 1930s, where there were deemed to be 180 crossings to the border. But then when they had another look at it a couple of decades later, as you'll know well from traversing it, they decided there were over 200 crossings, and even what constitutes a border crossing. So the terrain. I was very amused at Margaret Thatcher's take on this, that she wanted a border that didn't have all these kinks and wiggles, as she described it. So that's another one of the messages. Like, how feasible is it to control a border that porous? We're well aware that they were never able to control the border. They were never able to manage the border in a practical way, or even in terms of security. So I think that's another one of the messages, that you allow a border sometimes to collapse under the weight of its own messiness, or perhaps its own contradictions. That takes a long time, and you can reach a certain settlement. And I think people had reached a certain settlement. There's also, I would think, a distinct way of thinking around the border, and people who inhabit the border hinterland. They are a different people. And I'm not talking about nationality. I'm not talking about political affiliation. I suppose I'm talking more about just being a product of a borderland. That is a distinct way of perhaps thinking that is colored by your experience of being on a frontier. And again, the question is, how do those people come to terms with their situation or their dispensation? And if they're okay with it, that means something very different, if there has been a degree of accommodation. And that's not just about politics and economics, it's also about sport, and it's about culture. I was very struck by writers over the years like Tyrone Guthrie and Hubert Butler, who were making the case for dialogue across the border.
Yes.
Arguing that a lot of these divisions were political and artificial, as opposed to being truly cultural, and that there could be this sense of dialogue across the border, again, taking the heat out, or lessening some of the contentious issues,
That brings me back to the idea of the imagination. And if your story, if your history of the border was thought of as a story, had an arc, then what you see is the gradual strengthening of Ireland's imagination and our sense of pluralism and what was possible I asked you earlier about what limitations perhaps the original Irish delegation were suffering from. And I wonder if back those days, not just those men, but perhaps the Western imagination in general, rather fixated on symbolism as a source of identity. So if you read the original transcripts of the discussions, they're really fixated on having to swear an oath to the Queen.
Yeah.
And then much less so than partition. And anyone reading it now goes, partition is much more significant. Yeah. And I wonder if during the 20th century, we went from seeing our identity hooked on symbols to get much more sense of a land as an identity or a map.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And therefore, obviously, maps have their difficulties too, as including borders. But all the same, at least a land can potentially be more pluralistic. And you can have lots of different, you can have diversity in a country the way you can't have diversity with the idea of a royal leader or a pope or whatever you got.
Yeah.
So, and that's sort of what I see in your story is this widening of the imagination from the original act of partition, which seems like a big failure of imagination, to the Good Friday Agreement, which is a major imaginative leap.
Yeah, I think you're right about that complete preoccupation, if not obsession, with symbols, but also with territory. You know, one of the great shifts was to try and get people not so much to think about territory or symbols or emblems, but to think about people and to think about land, you know, and shared. I mean, even that whole idea of a shared island, you know, we might say that's become cliched now, but, you know, it's remarkably important how you use language and how you characterize an island and what is contained within that island. And obviously, I mean, that developed into a political narrative for some in the sense of taking the focus away from territory and towards people, you know, and, you know, there was no point in talking about territory or flags or symbols if you couldn't bring the people together. And I could give the example of rugby. Haven't they managed it quite well? You know, not without problems over the years. They had to come to accommodations. But, you know, rugby was organised on a provincial basis from the 1880s in Ireland. And they were able to retain that all-Ireland team and that all-Ireland sense of an Irish rugby identity. You know, it didn't belong to one political side. So that is an illustration that it could be done. It couldn't be done in soccer. They didn't manage it in soccer. You know, we often heard ourselves saying that, particularly when Irish soccer's fortunes revived, you know, what would an all-Ireland soccer team be like, you know? And again, that would never have been about, you know, land and territory. That was about soccer players. That was about, you know, bringing the best of the land into one team, you know. So certainly, there's no doubt about that. I mean, there has been very interesting shifts over the years. Even looking at the archive of Sean Lemass, for example, he became Taoiseach, and, you know, he told his cabinet on the first week he became Taoiseach, he said, "Gentlemen, there will always be a Northern Ireland. What are we going to call it?" Because they were still calling it the Six Counties, and that offended many. And there are still people today who will call it the Six Counties. And, you know, they're not going to change the terminology that they use. But Lemass was making the point that we can actually think and speak differently about what we feel deeply about, with a view to actually trying to create more of a sense of an island that we can work together with. And he wasn't talking about the ending of partition. He wasn't talking in De Valera terms about putting pressure on Britain to undo the damage. He was just talking about talking and about perhaps avoiding the use of language that was clearly offensive for certain people on the island. And okay, you can say that's obvious to us now. That involved somersaults in the late 1950s.
Yes, and to the extent it's quite strange to look back at it. It seems like under-evolved. I want to ask you one question that we got from a participant here, Anne Loveday. Maybe you don't know. I'm very interested in this myself. She's educated in England, and she's wondering now what Irish schools teach about the history of the period.
About the history of this period?
Yes, partition.
They teach a lot. I'm very pleased to see that on the Lebensjahr curriculum, there's a particular attention given to partition. There's a section on partition. And, you know, a lot of the stuff that the Tower Museum are covering in terms of its origins, its impact and its legacy. So it's not shied away from in a way that it was. And the amount of older people who have told me, you know, our history deliberately stopped in 1916 because the things that came afterwards were too painful to contemplate.
Well, that's my recollection as well from the, I guess, the early 90s, loads of 19th century.
Yeah. I mean, there was also a deliberate determination to perhaps end before the partition of Ireland and before the Civil War, that they wanted to end on a glorious note with the War of Independence. But even they couldn't do that because the glorious note, of course, also includes the partition of Ireland. So it's not the vindication of the ambitions that they set themselves and the dreams that they were hoping to realize. But yes, partition is dealt with very seriously in the curriculum now. And I was also struck, of course, by the amount of people who told me who had been educated in Northern Ireland that they didn't learn enough about the history of the Republic, you know. Which again, when you think about it on a small island, is a terrible failing. Yeah.
Well, my sons here in Belfast go to an integrated school, so mixed, but still, it is more of a UK curriculum, and so I find that a little frustrating because.
Well, you have to remind yourself as well, Garrett, and you'll know this when you're talking about a UK curriculum. You know. Britain always looms, you know, much larger in the Irish consciousness than Ireland does in the British consciousness, you know, and we have to constantly remind ourselves of that. You know, when people ask me why, for example, the border wasn't discussed in any serious way during the Brexit referendum campaign, I said, because they don't care and they're not interested and they're not educated about it. You know, one of the reasons I was determined to write the border book, I suppose, was after Brexit, because I was just so angry in many ways that there had been such an ignorance and dismissal of the complications of the border, as if all of these issues had been settled and it couldn't possibly be worth considering, you know. So we do have to remind ourselves sometimes of the way in which their education doesn't factor in Ireland to the extent that, you know, certainly in the Republic, we would factor in a consideration of the consequences of British policy. You know, one of the first courses I studied in UCD when I was an undergraduate over 30 years ago was the Irish policy of the British government. And Ronan Fanning used to teach that course, used to constantly refer to the perennial difficulty of commanding British attention. You know, when are you actually going to take this country seriously and try and come up with, you know, solutions to the problems? Well, only when we have our bigger fish fried.
Well, I was interested there reading your book, and perhaps Michael Laughlin's there recently again, that there was an interesting parallel recently when the DUP held the balance of power in Westminster. But that's what happened with the Irish Parliamentary Party, and that really helps them get the Home Rule Bill through.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the Liberal Nationalist Alliance, and it's on a much bigger scale than the DUP, you know, they were able to prop up a government with a relatively small group. I mean, well, at the height of their power, the Irish Parliamentary Party held 86 seats in Westminster, and they held the balance of power.
I was interested while reading your book. You mentioned that Margaret Thatcher was leaned on a little from the United States to encourage her in the direction of the Anglo-Irish Agreement. And another thing we're hearing about lately, another term that's flying around, is the idea from senior US politicians, is the idea that the USA is the guarantor of the Good Friday Agreement. To what extent is that true?
No, it's not true. I mean, you know, this is not an agreement, a formal agreement that incorporates the United States of America, you know. This is an agreement between Belfast, Dublin, and London. It gives
the impression he signed something, but this is not the case.
Well, no, I mean, that story actually begins. I was reading Seamus Mallon's book there not so long ago, and he was talking about the mood of despair within the SDLP after the collapse of Sunningdale and power sharing. And they'd nowhere to go, and they were broke, and they were really fed up. And as he put it, the only place left for John Hume to go was America. So off he went, and he got Jimmy Carter's administration in 1977 to agree you know, that they would welcome a power sharing solution and that they would encourage a coming together of the different sides. And that was unprecedented, that intervention. And John Hume and his colleagues were again annoyed that not enough attention was given to that, and that perhaps Dublin wasn't taking it seriously enough. But then it was revisited, because John Hume kept working those connections. And then by the 1980s, early 1980s, when Reagan is in power, there's a lot of behind the scenes maneuvering to try and get the American administration at that most senior level to intervene, to lean on Maggie. And of course, Margaret Thatcher, there were very few people who could lean on Margaret Thatcher. Ronald Reagan was one of them. So that was a very clever strategy by the SDLP at that time. And of course, they got him to lean on her. And she was open to it. I mean, she actually came in her memoirs to decry the signing of the Anglo-Irish Treaty. She regarded it as a great mistake. But she was open at the time. And again, it goes back to some of your earlier points. Why was she open to being, somewhat more flexible than her persona and her rhetoric suggested? Again, get this complication away from us. I've other things to be worrying about. I mean, there's an extraordinary exchange after the signing of the Anglo-Irish Agreement when they're toasting it. Herself and Garrett Fitzgerald, the Taoiseach, are toasting it with a glass of champagne. And he mentions the possibility of getting money from the International Fund for Ireland, for Northern Ireland. And she was disgusted. And she kind of waved her hand in the general direction of Northern Ireland. And she said, more money for those people. Look at their roads. Look at their schools. She said, I need that money from my people. Now, isn't that remarkably revealing? I need that money for my people. These are not my people.
Yeah, and so how do you think that would pan out, though? Will this idea of the United States as guarantor of the Good Friday Agreement, is that something that you think will solidify and become a significant factor in the next few years?
To be honest with you, I was looking at Mulvaney there, who's arrived over as, as the envoy. And part of me was wondering, is that still a necessary part of the apparatus, of the diplomatic apparatus in relation to Northern Ireland? Now, you always want to be very careful not to tempt fate. You would like to think that there would be some semblance of an evolving or maturing politics that wouldn't involve hand-holding by the United States anymore. There is a part of me that has wondered that in the last couple of years. There's no doubt of the importance of the intervention. And when you consider how the Good Friday negotiations or the Belfast Agreement negotiations were handled pretty adroitly, and American intervention was crucial there. You have to wonder, more than 20 years on, what level of American intervention is needed. I mean, do you think Donald Trump is interested in Northern Ireland?
Me, no, not particularly.
I do wonder.
I think it's more likely to be. I suspect it would be considered a bit of a Democrat possession.
Yeah, and I've no doubt that they do take it seriously. And I mean, Nancy Pelosi has been very trenchant in asserting that they're going to make life very difficult when it comes to a possible post-Brexit trade agreement with the United States. If the border is a pawn, or if there's any, compromising of the agreement. And I mean, that sentiment is still very strong.
He also put some broader negativity about Brexit, which Trump has spoken in favour of. So, yeah. I mean, one suspects that's really the thing they're after. That's the thing they're problematizing, Brexit.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, but again, doesn't it illustrate as well how, the Irish question can become useful for a variety of different strategies, but it can also become a huge inconvenience.
We've had a couple of people asking about the water boundary and the foil, the unsettled location of the border there. Have you any views on how that might play out?
That's one thing I haven't.
Perhaps, but.
No, it's not something I've thought much about. I mean, it was an issue right from the start, and it had to be adjudicated on. How do you manage the waterways? And I mean, the creation of Waterways Ireland, was regarded as a very practical and progressive step, again, to try and prevent it becoming a contentious issue. But I'm not quite sure how that fits into the current scenario.
Is there any sense when we think about Irish independence and the energy there, or perhaps the despair that led to those moves. Is there any sense that Brexit has its similarities? Because there's no doubt that a lot of Brexiteers feel this is their revolution. And
well, I mean, they talk about taking back control. You know, I mean, if you look at all the mantras that they're using, you can draw direct parallels with a lot of nationalist movements, you know, not just the Irish one. The idea of taking back control, the idea that they are leaving a cruel empire, in this case, you know, the Brussels bureaucracy, and the idea that they are going to be masters of their own destiny, which has always, of course, been a key plank of a nationalist agenda. I mean, I was talking earlier on today about the 100th anniversary of the hunger strike of Terence Mcsweeney, who died in Brixton Prison in 1920, in October 1920. You know, and he was very much of that ilk, you know, and there were huge advantages to him in pitting himself, as he saw it, one emaciated individual against the might of the British Empire. And, you know, that became a very important emotional appeal as well. And there is a lot of an emotion bound up with the Brexit issue. I mean, I'm not remotely in favor of being completely dismissive of those who voted in favor of Brexit. You know, there can be a huge snobbery sometimes in dismissing the level of sentiment and emotion around that question, as well as the hard-headed thinking that some of them would see as being central to their thoughts about Brexit. You know, if you ask fishermen, for example, in various parts of England why they voted in favor of Brexit, you know, they'd be able to tell you exactly what they think of the European fisheries policy, you know. So, you know, it's not all just about bloody-minded Tory nationalism, but at the same time, it is playing in to a lot of those basic sentiments that we would have associated with a historic nationalism, perhaps. You know, it does seem almost quaint in some respects, but we also recognize, I suppose, the forces that it can unleash. And that's the other thing about nationalism, and that's not just about Ireland or Britain. You know, again, if you go back to where we started and the convulsions of that period that led up to our partition, I mean, there was the ultimate manifestation of the horrors of extreme nationalism, and what can happen as well after the revolution. Sometimes civil wars can be much more vicious than the wars of national liberation.
We are back where we started. However, I'm going to say one more thing before we wrap up here. And thank you, everybody who's been contacting me. I think we did manage to touch on most of your points, but I apologize that we can't answer every question. I would actually, this is almost a creative question. I love the way in your book about the border, you close most chapters with a look at what art was doing during the phase you just discussed. Mostly writers, not just writers, photographers as well. What's behind that style of presenting an historic story?
I can't write history without drawing on that pool, you know. I've never been able to do it, and I'll tell you why. The archive, the documentary record, can tell you what happened. It can't tell you what it felt like. Writers perform a hugely important function in relation to telling you what it felt like. It mightn't be their direct experience, sometimes it is, but it is for me about their ability to encapsulate a sense of what things feel like, you know. And you can have a very cold, austere type of history writing that takes out that humanity. And even in Queen's, you know, I remember the great A.T.Q. Stewart, who was a great historian of Ulster. And he made that point in the early 1990s. Far too many historians are writing history with the humanity taken out. You know, that, you know, history is about feelings. And too many people are writing history without the feelings included. And I'd agree with him. And I think that's the main reason why I do it.
All right. Well, thank you very much for your time.
It was absolutely lovely to talk to you. And thank you for all the insights you gave me on the border, because you actually walked it,
yes.
Which I didn't. And that's a very important point.
There's a lot of fields, but it's a certain style of research. I wouldn't call myself an historian. I wouldn't really dare do that.
But you see, the border can't be, you know, the preserve of historians when it comes to writings about the border. That's the other thing. I mean, some of the most illuminating insights we've had on the border have been from people like you, have been people who are actually walking it and feeling it and observing it. you can get an awful lot of insight in a way that you'll never get from an archive when you approach it like that.
Yeah, well, I mean, things you've mentioned and I've returned to as well, the importance of the imagination and the emotional aspect of our relationship to the land are very intangible things. And that's what I really enjoyed about you, as you just explained, why you utilize the work of artists as well. And one gets a fuller sense of the story, because we do tend to conceive of things in frames and as narratives, I suppose.
Yeah.
And maybe this is a limitation. I think in a way, the original Irish delegation, I was talking about their lack of imagination. That was maybe they thought it was going to end one way. Yeah. And they couldn't get over the fact that actually the story had a different ending.
Yeah.
And it took
I think you're absolutely right.
50s to accept that.
Yeah.
So the story concept can limit you also, but all the same, this seems to be how our brains work and how we understand the world. And so, yes, I think it's an important thing to consider. And
absolutely, yeah.
My work, and I think you do it beautifully in yours. So thank you very much.
Thank you all for joining us.
Yes, we went from 140 to 161, so we must have been doing something right. Okay, and thank you everybody who typed in your comments and questions. I'm going to have a look at them now. And good night, Diarmaid.
Good night. Lovely to talk to you, and thank you all very much.